"Please buy me and make me your wife," whispered the Apache woman chained like a wild animal. The chain was maybe 8 feet long. One end bolted to a post sunk in hardpan, the other clamped around her left ankle with a lock the size of a man's fist. I remember that because when I first saw it, I was looking at the chain before I was looking at her. The way it caught the morning light off the dust, the way it lay in a little coil behind her heel like something waiting. I'd come to Parnell's trading post for flour, a new axle pin, and whatever nails they had left over from the last freight wagon. 3 things. I had a list. I am not a man who wanders off his list. She was sitting on an upturned barrel near the side wall, her back straight in the way of someone who has decided that whatever they take from you, they do not get to take that. Her wrists were not bound, just the ankle. She was maybe 30, maybe a few years younger, it was hard to say. Her face had the particular stillness of someone who has learned that every expression costs something, and so she'd stopped spending them freely. Dark eyes. A bruise along her left cheekbone that had gone yellow at the edges, 4 or 5 days old, maybe 6. I walked past her to get to the counter. I am not proud of that. I am telling you what I did. Harlan Parnell was behind the counter picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. He had a way of standing that made the room feel smaller, big through the shoulders, soft in the gut, the particular look of a man who had discovered that other people's desperation was a reliable business model. He'd been running that post for 11 years, and I'd been trading there for 6 of those years, and we had the kind of relationship where I didn't like him, and he didn't care, and we got along fine. "Walt," he said. "Harlan, flour, axle pin, nails if you have them." He started moving. I pulled my list out and put it on the counter and kept my eyes on it, which is what I did when I was working to not think about something. Then she said something, low in Apache to herself or to someone not there. I don't know what the words were. I know the sound of them, the flat quiet of them, like water moving over stone in the dark, like something old and continuous, that the noise of the place hadn't been able to touch. Parnell came back with the flour, set it heavy on the counter. "New acquisition," he said, which is how I knew he'd seen me notice. "Comanchero brought her up from below the Picos. She'll go quick." He said it the way you'd say a horse will go quick at a sale, matter of fact, no different from the flour. "What's the price on the flour?" $1.20, $2.50 for the axle pin. "Nails?" 70 cents a pound. I got about 8 pounds. I stood there doing arithmetic. I was 47 years old. I had run free-range cattle across 160,000 acres of high grass for 19 years, starting with nothing and working my way up to nothing slightly more organized. I'd had a wife once, Clara. She died of a fever when our boy was 3, and our boy died of the same fever 4 days later. And after that I did not spend much time in towns, and I did not keep much company, and that was not a thing I thought needed explaining or fixing. A man is what he survives and what he keeps, and I had kept my land and my cattle and my code, and that had seemed like enough. The code, that is the thing. A man has a code or he doesn't. If he does, it isn't optional. It doesn't bend because the bending would be convenient or because standing by it costs something. I'd lived by mine for 47 years. I knew what it said. I'd known since I walked past her what it was going to cost me today, and I did not like the cost, and I was going to pay it anyway. "What's her price?" I said. Parnell stopped moving. He looked at me with the little measuring look he had, the one where he's figuring whether you're a buyer or a complication. "You in that market, Walt. Didn't figure you for it." "I'm asking her price." $40, he said, same as a good saddle horse. $40 was more than I had on me. I had 22. I'd need to come back. Or, and I thought about this, standing there with my hand flat on the counter, I could leave the flour and the axle pin, take the nails at 70 cents and still fall short. "I'll give you 22 now. Come back with the balance in 4 days. She might not be here in 4 days. Then I'll give you 22 now, and you'll put my name on her until I come back with the rest." He chewed on that. I looked at the splinter of wood turning in his fingers, then at the wall behind him where there was a calendar from 1873 with a painting of mountains that looked nothing like any mountains I'd ever seen. He made the sound men make when they're deciding to accept something they don't love about a situation. "4 days," he said. "After that she goes to whoever comes with a price." I laid the $22 on the counter. I left without the flour and without the axle pin. I took the nails because I needed them, and because I was still a man with a list, whatever else was happening around me. I did not look at her on the way out. I rode the first few miles feeling the particular weight of doing the right thing badly. I had walked past her. I had stood there talking prices on flour while she sat on a barrel with a lock around her ankle. I had taken my time about it. A better man would have moved faster, I told myself. Then I told myself to stop it because that kind of thinking doesn't move anything forward and I had moving to do. I rode for 2 days back to my camp. I had a line camp then on the east slope of the Caprock. A decent one, dug into the slope for wind shelter, a good spring, a covered pen for the horses that kept 3 or 4 animals comfortable through the worst of winter. I ate cold beans the first night and nothing the second morning, and I thought through what I was doing and what I was going to do with it when it was done. I had no plan past the buying. That is the honest truth. I knew she needed out of that chain, and I knew my code said I was the one who was going to get her out of it. What happened after that, where she went, what she did, what I did with a woman on my range who had nowhere to be and no reason to be there, I had not thought through, and I am not going to tell you I had. I have never been a man who dresses things up. I gathered what I had. I sold 3 steers to a drover passing through, a man named Galt who gave honest prices because we'd done business together before and he respected a man who didn't try to talk the weight up. I came up with $31 and some change. Added to the 18 I had left after the nails, I had just over $49. Enough and then a little over. I rode back to Parnell's on the 3rd day. Made it by late afternoon, the light going copper and long across the flat. 3 hours of it left. She was still there, still on the barrel, still with her back straight. I went to the counter and didn't say anything except to lay the $18 alongside what I'd paid before and nod toward where she was. Parnell counted it slowly, the way a man does when he's trying to make you feel the transaction, then put it in his cash box, got the key from a nail on the back wall, and walked over to her without ceremony and unlocked the ankle chain. It fell from her boot and clinked on the hardpan floor, and she looked at it lying there for a moment. Then she looked up at me. I don't know how to describe that look except to say there was nothing grateful in it. That was what struck me. Most people you'd help in a situation like that would have something on their face, relief, or the thing under relief that is the beginning of debt, a softness in the eyes that says I owe you. She didn't have that. She had something harder and more careful. The look of someone computing the new arrangement, reading the variables, deciding what to trust and how much and how far. I said to Parnell her things. He looked at me. She came without. Then she came without, I said. I walked to the door and I stopped with my hand on the frame and I said to her, without turning all the way around, "My camp is a day's ride north. You can come or you can go where you like. Up to you." And I walked to my horse and I mounted up and I rode north. I did not look back for a long time. When I did, maybe a mile out, she was on foot about 40 yards behind me, moving at a pace that said she'd been walking hard country since before she could remember, her eyes on the distance ahead. Not on me, on the country. That was how it started. Her name was Nasha. She told me that on the 2nd day when we stopped at the spring to water the horse, and she drank from her cupped hands downstream of where he drank, without being told to. She said her name without being asked, and I said mine, Walt Garber, and she repeated the second half of it once, the way you repeat something you're deciding whether to keep. Garber. And that was all the introduction we did. We didn't talk much at first. That suited me. I'd spent years not talking and I'd gotten good at it, the way you get good at anything you practice long enough. We made camp by a dry creek bed the first night, and she slept on the far side of the fire from me. I gave her my second blanket, and she took it without comment and folded herself into it with her back to the fire. And I lay on my side watching the coals and listening to the country settle into dark. In the morning she was up before me. That bothered me more than I expected. I had prided myself on being an early riser. It was part of what I thought I knew about myself, and apparently it wasn't going to be mine to pride myself on anymore. She was up in that gray light before the sun shows, and she'd have the small fire rebuilt and water heating by the time I came up out of my blankets, and she'd do it without making a sound, which meant she'd been practicing that quietness for a long time. She watched everything. I don't mean nervously, not the watching of someone expecting an attack at every edge. I mean the way a person watches who has learned to read weather and land and men, the way you read a text you can't afford to misunderstand. She'd look at the way a horse stood and know before I did that his near foreleg was going sore. She'd look at the horizon and say nothing, and then it would rain 2 hours later. She'd look at a stretch of grass and read where the cattle had been and how long ago and how many. That was useful to me. I told myself that was why I was pleased by it, usefulness. A man alone on a big stretch of range accumulates his blind spots over time because there's no one to correct them. I'd been accumulating mine for years. I don't know exactly when I stopped thinking of the situation as temporary. It wasn't a single moment. There was no morning I woke up and decided. It was more like the way a season changes. You're inside it, and then one day you notice you've been inside it for a while. Two people's habits start to occupy the same space and the space adjusts. She had her corner of the camp and I had mine, and between those two corners we developed a kind of traffic, a daily pattern of who went where and when and for what, and that pattern had the feel of something that had been there a while. She taught herself to talk to me in English over those first weeks. She already had some, more than I'd realized, but she'd been choosing not to use it at Parnell's. I understood that without needing her to explain it. She picked it up fast, faster than I had any right to expect, and the way she talked when she got to where she could talk was like the way she moved, nothing wasted. Words landed one at a time and given their space, and you paid attention because there was never going to be a repeat. "Why?" she said to me one evening. We were eating salt beef and pan bread, which was about the range of my cooking then. The fire was low. I knew what she was asking. "Wasn't right," I said. "What was being done to you?" "Many men see things not right. They walk past." "I know. I did too. First time." I said it because it was true and because I decided I wasn't going to spend my time with this woman making myself look better than I was. "First time I walked past." She was quiet for a moment, "But you came back." "I came back." She looked at the fire. "What do you want from me?" There it was. The question I'd been waiting for, or waiting not to have asked, because I wasn't sure I had an answer that didn't sound like something else. I thought about it for a while and she waited without pressing, which was something I was coming to notice about her. She could wait the way land waits, holding what it holds, not asking the land beside it to fill the space. "Nothing," I said finally. "That's the truth of it. I don't want a thing from you." She looked at me then with the measuring look I was starting to know. "Not a slave." "No." "Not a," she said a word in Apache I didn't have. "I don't know that word." She thought about it for a moment, working the translation. "A woman kept for a man's use." "No," I said, "not that either." "Then what?" I looked at the fire. "I don't know what to call it. You can stay and work the range alongside me, which you've been doing and you've been doing it well, or you can go when you want to go, nothing holding you here, no debt if that's what you're worrying on." She didn't say anything to that. She put another piece of wood on the fire and watched it catch. "I will think on it," she said. I nodded, fair enough. 3 days later she was still there, and the thing about her being there had shifted slightly in the way she carried herself. She'd stopped having the look of someone calculating the exit. She was just there. I didn't say anything about it, neither did she. It was a hard autumn. We pushed the cattle to lower ground ahead of an early cold snap that came down off the high plains in October with ice in it, the kind of ice that gets into a man's coat through every gap and doesn't let go until March. We lost 3 calves to a cougar working the north draws and another 4 to a fence collapse in the second week of November when the ground heaved under a post and took 20 yards of wire with it. I was running short, and I knew it, and I didn't say anything about it because saying it wouldn't fix it. Nasha knew. She always knew, even when I said nothing. She started taking less at meals. I noticed, called her on it. She said she wasn't hungry. I said I had been watching and that wasn't true, and we sat with that between us for a while with the fire popping. We're short, I said. We'll be short through the winter maybe, but there is enough. I know you are careful, she said. I do not want to make you shorter. You don't, you work and your work has value, same as any hand. She looked at me in the way she had, direct and a little long, like she was reading something I hadn't said out loud yet. You have no one, she said. It wasn't an accusation or a question exactly, just an observation she was laying down. Had a wife, long time ago. She didn't push on that. She had the right kind of quiet for hard information. She didn't fill it up with sounds to make you feel better about having said it. She just let it sit where it landed and waited to see if there was more. My husband died, she said after a time. 3 winters passed, he was a good man. I'm sorry. The men who sold me, they came saying they were trading food. She paused. My people were hungry, it was a bad year. I didn't have anything to say to that. There are things you hear that don't have adequate language around them, and putting inadequate language on them is worse than nothing. I just sat with it. The men who came with them, she said, 4, they took 6 women, I was 1. She was looking at the fire. Her voice hadn't changed, not flat, not performed, just even. I do not know where the others are now. I thought about that for a while. I thought about 5 women somewhere, unchained or still chained, and about what I could and couldn't do about it. I'm sorry, I said again, which I knew wasn't enough, and said it anyway. She looked at me then. You bought one, she said, not reproaching me for not buying the others, just saying the fact. That is not nothing. We sat by the fire for a long time that night. The wind had teeth to it and the horses were restless in the pen, and somewhere to the north, a coyote was working through something long and carrying. She pulled the blanket up around her shoulders. I looked at stars through a gap in the cloud cover. Orion coming up in the southeast, the way he always does when it gets serious about being cold. Walt, she said. If you are willing, I would like to stay, not because I have no other place. She paused, and the pause had something in it, something she was arranging carefully before she set it down. Because I choose to stay, because this is a place worth choosing. I turned and looked at her. She was looking at the fire still, her jaw set in the way I'd come to know meant she'd already worked through what she was going to say and had decided on it and wasn't going to take it back regardless. Then stay, I said. She nodded once, the way you close a negotiation when both sides have said what they mean, and that was that. Winter came in hard and stayed hard. The kind of winter this country produces once in a decade to remind you what it is capable of when it decides to be 3 feet of snow on the flats by Christmas, ice in all the watercourses, cattle bunching in the draws with their backs to the wind, and needing broke ice every morning, and moved to wherever the grass still came through the cover. I lost 3 toes worth of feeling in my right foot on the worst night of January, riding back from the north fence in the dark, with a wind that had started somewhere in Canada and not stopped. It came back over 3 days by the fire, Nasha unwrapping and rewrapping the foot mourning, and night with strips of cloth soaked in something she'd put together from herbs she kept in a small tied bundle that I'd never seen the contents of. "You should not go out alone in that," she said on the third morning. "Sometimes it has to be one man and one horse," I said. "Yes, but next time it will be two." I started to say something about it being her decision and stopped myself, because that argument was over. I don't sleep well in the deep cold. Never have. Something in my joints objects to it, and my mind starts to run with nothing useful to carry. I'll lie in the dark for hours working through things that don't move, and the cold presses in at the edges of the blanket, and the fire gets low and needs feeding, and by the time I've fed it I'm awake for another 2 hours. Nasha knew this without being told. She'd hear me turn over in the dark and she'd say, quiet from her side of the fire, "Tell me something." Not a question, not pity, just a recognition that the dark is easier with a voice in it. So I'd tell her things. Not the important things at first, just the ranching things, the working through it in your head things, where to move the herd next week, whether the north fence was going to hold or whether I needed to get to it before the next heavy snow. What I'd need in spring and whether I had the money for it, and where the money might come from if I didn't. She'd listen and sometimes say something back, a question, a thought, once or twice, a better idea than the one I'd been turning over, and gradually the loop in my head would slow like a wheel losing its spin and I'd sleep. Then one night I told her about Clara. I didn't plan to. It came out the way those things do when you've been talking about something else for a while and the layers get thin. I told her about the fever, how fast it moved, how by the second day I knew what it was going to do and couldn't stop it, how I sat with Clara through 2 nights and she held on and then she didn't hold on. And then about Daniel. His name was Daniel. He had his mother's eyes and her way of tilting his head when he was working something out. He was 3 years old and he had just started to talk in full sentences, and he was using them to ask about everything he could see. Why is the sky the color it is? Why do horses have 4 legs and men have 2? Why does the fire make that sound? I told her about carrying him to the grave plot I dug myself in the frozen ground, because it was February, and the ground fought me the whole way, and it took 2 days, and I was glad of the work, because the work was the only thing keeping me from going somewhere I might not come back from. I talked for a long time. Longer than I'd talked about it to anyone since it happened. She didn't say anything until I'd stopped and stayed stopped for a while. "Daniel," she said, just the name, letting it sit in the space. "Yeah. He sounds like a man who would have been good." I had to stop for a minute. Nobody had ever said it that way, not what he was, but what he would have been. Like she was seeing the whole life that got cut off, the man at the end of it, and saying, "I see that too." It hit me somewhere under the ribs that I hadn't had anything reach in a long time, and I pressed my knuckles against my mouth and breathed through it. "Yeah," I said, "he would have been." She moved across the fire then. She didn't say anything. She sat close enough that I could feel the warmth of her in the cold, and she put her hand on my arm, not squeezing, not performing comfort, just resting it there. The way you lay a hand on something that is solid and that you trust and that you want to feel under your hand. And she left it there. I looked at her face in the firelight. She was looking at the fire, not at me, not trying to give me anything or take anything, not asking for anything back. Just there. Present. The way a person is when they've decided that your grief is not something to manage or move past but something to sit beside. I covered her hand with mine. She didn't pull away. We stayed like that a long time, until the fire got low and needed feeding. I got up and fed it, and the night moved on, and when I lay back down I slept until morning. I should tell you about the trouble, because there was trouble. There always is when a man tries to live a particular way in country that has decided it has opinions about how things ought to go. His name was Voss, Cord Voss. He ran a ranch about 30 miles west, bigger operation than mine, more hands, more land. the particular kind of man who measures everything by what it says about him relative to other men. He came by in March, first decent weather week, when the mud was just starting to firm up. Him and two of his riders. I was mending fence in the lower pasture when they came up along the draw. He sat his horse and looked at me in the way men like him look at men they've decided are below them in some accounting they're always keeping. The assessment look, finding the edges. "Heard you took in a squaw," he said. "I kept working, that's so. Whole country's heard it. You ain't doing yourself any favors, Walt. Town's got opinions about a man does that. Town can keep them." One of his riders shifted his weight. Voss put up a hand to still him without looking back. "She Apache." "She is." "You know there's people who'd pay good money for a young Apache woman. People better equipped to deal with that kind of situation than a man operating on his own out here." I set down my fencing pliers. I turned and looked at him. He was a big man on a good horse, and he had two men behind him, and I was alone with a fence post, and none of that changed what I was about to say. "Cord, you came all this way to tell me the country has opinions. I've heard you. Now ride back the way you came." He looked at me for a long moment. The horse shifted under him. "You living with her, Walt, like a married man lives with a woman." I didn't say anything. "A man does that out here. People got questions about what kind of man he is." "Right on, Cord." "Just talking." "No, you came out here to say something and you've said it and there's nothing here for you now. Ride on." He held the look a little longer. Men like him don't back down cleanly, they back down with a little lean forward first, a little show that it's their choice to leave. "You're going to have trouble, Walt," he said. "I'm just giving you fair notice." Then he turned his horse and his two men turned with him and they rode back west along the draw. I stood in the lower pasture until the sound of hooves was gone. I stood there looking at the fence post and the wire and thinking about what he'd said and what was behind what he'd said. Then I picked up my pliers and went back to work. Nasha didn't ask about it when I came in for the evening. She had a way of reading my face that was more accurate than most people's direct questioning, and she read what had happened and she let it sit. We ate supper. After dinner she was working on a bridle repair she'd been doing in the evenings, soaking the leather in a tin pail, working it with her hands in the lamplight. Good hands. I watched her work without quite deciding to. "Voss came by," I said. "I know, I heard them while I was at the spring." She didn't look up. "He is the kind of man who believes his opinions make things true. He'll make trouble for us if he can find a way." "Yes." She turned a piece of leather over, pressed a seam with her thumb. "Are you afraid of trouble?" "No." "No," she agreed. "I know." She said it plainly, without ceremony or build-up, not flattering me, not saying it for effect, just stating what she knew the way she stated other things she'd observed. She had been watching me for 5 months by then. She'd watched how I handled difficulty and hardship and hard men, and she had her conclusions, and she was willing to say them out loud. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, "There might come a time I have to stand up to him in a way that costs something. That could make things harder here." "I will stand with you," she said. "Nasha." "I am not asking if I may," she said. She set the bridle down on her knee and looked at me. "I am telling you what I will do. It is what I will do." Spring came. The cattle had come through better than I'd feared, 11 head lost through the winter, which was less than the 2 winters before that and less than Voss lost. I heard later from Galt the drover. The grass came in strong off the snowmelt and I pushed the herd to the North Flats, and by May I was feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, something cautious and quiet that a man my age doesn't trust too fast. Something that might have been called hopeful if I were the kind of man who used that word easily. Nasha and I were working together by then the way 2 people work together when they've stopped thinking about how they're doing it. It was just the work, who goes where, who does what. the split-second adjustments two riders make when they're pushing cattle and they know each other well enough that a look does the job of a sentence. She'd learned the cattle, learned the land, learned the horse I'd put her on. A dun mare named Peg who'd been difficult with other riders, the kind of difficult that means she has opinions and has been waiting for someone worth having the conversation with. Nasha rode her like they'd always known each other, which I think in some way they had, in whatever way a horse knows a calm hand and a presence that doesn't ask for more than it gives. There was a day in late May, a clear day, the kind this country makes maybe 10 of all year, where the sky is a specific blue that seems too perfect to be true, the kind of day that makes you feel the country was put here on purpose. We'd been moving a cut of cattle back from the North Draws, which had gone boggy in the snowmelt, and we'd gotten them to high ground and turned them loose, and we sat our horses on the rim of a low butte and looked out across the grass. The light lay flat and gold on everything, and you could see 20 miles in every direction, and nothing was moving except the grass in the wind. She was sitting peg easy, one hand on the saddle horn looking out at it. The wind moved her hair. She had a quiet on her face I'd come to know, the quiet she put on when things had gone right and she knew it. Not happiness in the loud sense, something older and quieter than that. Satisfied. I looked at her longer than I'd intended to. She turned and caught me. She held my eyes without looking away. Then she said, "What?" "Nothing," I said. She looked at me a moment longer, reading. "You are deciding something," she said. "Maybe." She turned back to the grass. "Take your time," she said. And she said it without impatience, without any edge in it, just the plain statement of a woman who is not going anywhere and who knows it. I looked at the grass and the sky and the light on the distant rim of the caprock. I thought about the winter and the mornings and the nights by the fire. I thought about her hand on my arm in the dark. I thought about what she'd said when I'd asked her to stay, because I choose to stay, because this is a place worth choosing. There are men who'd need a lot more time than that. I didn't. But I wasn't ready to say it yet. I was getting there. Voss's trouble came in June. The way trouble comes when a man has been thinking about it for a while, with organization, and with other men's muscle. 3 riders I didn't recognize came onto my land from the west side on a mid-morning, the hour when a working man is likely to be away from camp. I was not away from camp. I was repairing a saddle in front of the lean-to, which is visible from the western approach if you know where to look, and if they'd been watching they'd have known I was there. They rode in anyway. Nasha was at the spring filling water jugs, about 60 yards back along the creek. The 3 men came in at a trot and pulled up in my yard. One of them, a thick-built man with a red face and a hat that had seen too many years, said they'd heard I was keeping Apache horses that didn't belong to me on my range. I looked at them. I looked at their horses. I looked at the red-faced man's gun belt, worn high and self-consciously, the kind of wearing that says I want this noticed. I thought about what Voss was doing, which was reaching for a legal angle. Horse theft was serious business, and any charge of it would mean a sheriff and a hearing, and the kind of attention I didn't need. "That's not true," I said, "but you knew that before you came." Voss says. Voss is wrong, and if he sent you out here with that story he's not just wrong, he's lying for a purpose. Which means he's got something in mind, and you're his instrument for it. I'd think hard about being somebody's instrument. You were me. The red-faced man looked at his 2 companions. One of them had the look of a man who wasn't sure he'd signed up for what this was becoming. The other one was more committed. The red-faced man started to come off his horse. From behind the lean-to, Nasha walked into the yard. She had my Winchester carbine, mine, which had been leaning against the inside wall. She'd taken it when she heard them coming. She carried it in both hands, not leveled but present, held with the ease of someone who knows what they're holding. She stopped about 10 feet behind me and slightly to my left. She didn't say a word. She just stood there with that straight-back stillness she had, with the carbine in her hands, and looked at the three men with those dark eyes that offered them nothing. The red-faced man stopped halfway off his horse. He looked at her, he looked at me, he looked at her again. "You want to reconsider being somebody's instrument," I said again, the same flat tone. "All those horses on this land are mine, and I'll tell you their names and their ages and where I got each one if you need a full account. That's my range you're standing on. I'll ask you to leave it." A long moment. The committed one shifted his weight. The unsure one had made his decision and was sitting still and looking at something far off. The red-faced man settled back into his saddle. He turned his horse. The other two followed. They rode back west. I stood in my yard with my hands at my sides until the sound of them was gone, and then a while longer. Then I turned around. Nasha lowered the carbine. She looked at me with an even look. "You knew they were coming," I said. "I heard them on the western approach before you did." She held the carbine out to me. "I thought you might want it available." I took it. I stood in front of her for a moment and I looked at her face, the set of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes, the way she was standing like someone who had done what she'd said she would do and was neither proud nor bothered by it. "Nasha," I said. "Yes." "What you said in the winter, that you chose to stay." "Yes." "I want to make sure you know something." I stopped. "I have never been good at this particular kind of talking, the direct saying of the important things. I've always gotten there eventually, but I've always taken the long way. What you've given this place, what you are to it." I stopped again. "What you are to me. I want you to know I see it, not what you've done or what you're good at. What you are, the kind of person." She watched my face while I said it, reading the way she always read me. When I stopped, she was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. The same way she'd said it when I'd asked if she was afraid of trouble. The same plain statement of something she'd already known and was glad to have confirmed. Not dismissing what I'd said. Receiving it the way you receive something that belongs to you. "There's something I want to ask you," I said. "And I want to be clear before I ask it that whatever you answer, what I just said doesn't change. That's not a condition." She waited. "Whether you'd be willing to stay here as," I had the word. I'd had it for a while and I'd been getting to it at my own pace. "As my wife, if that's something you'd want." She looked at me for a time. Her eyes were steady and her face was still, and then something moved in it, not large, not dramatic, just a loosening, the way a held thing releases when it's time. She put one hand flat against my chest, over my heart. She could feel it going. I know she could because I could feel her feel it. "I have been waiting," she said, "for you to find those words." I put my hand over hers and held it there. "Found them," I said. We rode to the circuit preacher in August, when the grass was high, and the heat had leveled off into the steady warmth of late summer. His name was Burl Caffrey, and he'd been doing marriages and funerals and Sunday services across about 400 miles of territory for 30 years, and he'd seen more of the frontier than most men alive. He did not make us feel like anything required justification. He was the kind of man who's been long enough in the country to know that it sorts people differently than town does, and that the sorting is not always wrong. Nasha wore a dress she'd sewn herself from cloth I'd brought back from the town supply run, blue, a plain blue without pattern, and she wore it with the same straightness she wore everything. Her hair was down. She wore a small piece of beadwork at her collar that she'd had since before I knew her, the only thing she'd come with. Caffrey read the words. We said what we said. He shook my hand after with a good grip and nodded to Nasha with what I can only call respect, the nod of a man who reads people as a professional matter and has read her, and decided she merits it. We rode back in the long light of afternoon with the world the same as it had been that morning and entirely different. I won't tell you everything that has happened since. Some things a man keeps. But I'll tell you what I carry from it, because that's the point of telling it at all. I was 47 years old when I walked into Parnell's trading post with 3 things on my list. I had been alone for going on 14 years in the way a man is alone who has stopped expecting to be anything else. Not miserable. I want to be precise about that. A man can be alone and not be miserable. I had work I was good at and land I knew and a code I kept, and those things are not nothing. But there is a difference between a life that works and a life that is alive, and I had forgotten the feeling of the difference, and so I'd stopped noticing the absence. What Nasha gave me is not a soft thing. I want to be clear about that too, because I have heard men talk about love in ways that make it sound like a kind of softening, a relief from the hard edges of living. That is not what she gave me. She is a harder person than most men I know. She sees clearly, and she says what she sees, and she does not spend time making things prettier than they are. She has a code of her own that she keeps with the same stubbornness I keep mine, and our codes have not always aligned perfectly, and we have sat with that on occasion and worked through it. What she gave me is someone who looks at who I am with all the lights on and says, yes, not because of what I can provide or what I know or what I've built, though she respects those things, because of what I am. The particular man with his particular way of being in the world, with his losses and his habits and his long silences and his code. She looked at all of that and she chose it. That is the thing that a man my age, if he is going to want anything, wants. Not to be made comfortable. To be seen. To have what he's earned and what he's kept be recognized by someone whose recognition means something because she earned the right to give it. She stood beside me with a Winchester when there was trouble. She sat with me in the dark of the worst nights and did not try to talk me out of what the dark held. She put her hand on my arm in the cold when I was talking about my boy, and she didn't say anything because she understood that nothing needed to be said, that what was needed was just the weight of her hand and the fact of her being there. I have been given better than I deserved. I know that. A man who walked past once and came back on the third day doesn't deserve what I got, but she didn't give it to me because I deserved it. She gave it to me because she looked and she chose. That's what makes it worth having. Voss left us alone after the thing with his 3 men. I heard later he'd had his own troubles, a bank debt that came due badly, a hand who'd taken something to the county sheriff. I didn't follow it. I had my own affairs. The cattle did well that second year, and the third was hard but not breaking, and by the fourth I had a proper house. Not the line camp but a real structure, 2 rooms and a porch and a root cellar, and a pen for the horses that shut out the wind. I built most of it myself over 2 winters, working when the weather allowed. Nasha worked beside me on parts of it, the framing of the second room, the porch boards, the root cellar stairs. And there were men who came by and had looks on their faces about a woman doing that kind of work, and she did not appear to notice the looks or particularly care about them, which I respected and did not find surprising. Peg, the dun mare, foaled in the spring of the 4th year, a roan filly with her mother's stubborn eyes. Nasha named her in Apache, a word that means something like early light, or the light just before the sun, the particular gray-rose color of the sky in that minute before the day starts. It suited her. There is a thing Nasha does sometimes when I come in at the end of a long day. I'll be at the door getting my boots off, still carrying whatever the day was in my shoulders, and she'll look up from what she's doing, mending or working leather or just sitting with a cup of coffee in the last of the afternoon light, and she'll look at me. Just for a moment. A second, maybe 2. Nothing large about it, just, there you are. The whole weight of it in that look, the recognition and the something under recognition that is better than recognition, the thing that says I was waiting without saying I was waiting, the thing that is the opposite of being alone. I cannot tell you what it does to me. I've tried to find words for it a few times and I always get it wrong. The wrong word makes it smaller than it is. I will tell you this instead. Some evenings we sit on the porch after supper when the light goes long and gold across the grass, and the cattle have settled for the night, and there's nothing left to press on. She'll have mending or I'll be working on a small piece of tack, and we don't always talk. We've never needed to fill the silence, either of us. We just sit in the quiet the way two people sit who have come through something together and have the ease of that between them. Last week she put her hand on my arm the way she did that night by the winter fire, all that time ago. I looked at her, and she was looking at the grass and the long light on it. "This is a good life," she said. Not a surprise, not a revelation, just a true thing said out loud by a woman who doesn't waste words. Which is exactly why, coming from her, it meant everything. "Yeah," I said. "You made it good." I shook my head. "We did." She turned and looked at me then. That look, "There you are." The light went down slow across the grass. The roan filly moved in the pen. My wife sat beside me on the porch of the house I built, her hand warm on my arm, and I held it there, and I did not feel any need at all to be anywhere else or anyone else or any different than exactly what I was. That was enough. That was more than enough.